Hello again, my friends, and welcome to FISHTORY. So today we're going to talk about how you would go about taking an already established tank and turning it into a filterless tank. That is, a tank with no electrical or mechanical filtration, no sponge or air stone, just a biologically filtered tank. So let's talk about how you go about that, especially if you don't want any swings in parameters or any ill effects to your fish. Alright, right off the bat, I just want to mention that I keep lots of tanks lots of different ways. And if I have a tank like this 50-gallon rimless, I probably wouldn't want to go totally filterless on this with angelfish and apistogrammas and other mid-sized to larger sized fish, as well as just the bio load. Could it handle it? Of course it could. It would be fine. I would probably need to do water changes more often though. And currently I only have to do water top-offs. So that's why I want to, that's what I want to accomplish out of having a filterless tank is, one, a little bit less work with changing filters and things like that. I like that it's just self-contained, but I also like that I don't have to get in there and change things a lot. And I also like that I just replace what evaporates off. So here, you know, I put in another 5 gallons or so and we're back to being topped off. Now I'm fortunate because I have soft water where I live. So I only have 20 TDS coming out of the tap, and that's almost like distilled, or as they call it, RO water. And that makes for very easy top-offs. It means that I'm not adding a whole bunch of minerals back to the tank. So that's something to consider, is if you have really hard water, you might want to get an RO unit, or even if it's a small tank, maybe go buy a 5-gallon jug of the purified water that you can get at grocery stores like Sparkles or Crystal, or there's a whole bunch of different brands. You can fill them up for $2 or $3 for about 5 gallons usually in a big carboy. But let's talk about the actual mechanics of turning it into a tank like this. Now this is the extreme overgrown jungle tank, and the reason this style tank is being kept right now is because of the tiny fish that are in here and wanting them to be able to reproduce. So in here we've got dwarf pencilfish, red-tailed pencilfish. You can see them here. And we also have these full-grown, and they're only half an inch long. Sometimes they're called 3-spot, sometimes they're called clown or clown spot rasboras, but they're the small rasbora, one of the smallest rasboras. And to have babies, they're going to need to scatter their eggs and not find them. So they need very, very tight spaces like this, but they also need a abundant food source as well. So let's talk a little bit about when you're getting ready to turn your tank into a filterless tank. The way that I think is the easiest way is to simply, you could start by putting things like pothos or other plants that grow up and out of the tank. This is a native plant called Persicaria, and it, as well as some purple bamboo and a few other creeping jenny, are growing up and out of the filter. Here's some wisteria also growing up and out of the filter, out of the water. Now all these plants can grow submerged or immersed, and immersed means up and out of the water with its roots in the water. Now you can see that this filter is still on and it's still trickling, but I've allowed it to get clogged with the roots. I've allowed the roots to totally clog all the quote-unquote blades or media surface that's in here. So over time the water has slowed so that it's just trickling out. Let me show you another example of it, because I happen to have another tank that's at this stage right now. But if you literally just allow your filters to get clogged, and you need to watch and make sure that you're not letting it overflow up and out the back, you can do this by wedging something underneath the filter. A lot of times it comes with a little tab that you can turn and get a different angle on it, or just turn down the flow. And depending on the filter you have, if it's a hang off the back, you can adjust it by moving it or pushing a lever, or you can also restrict the inflow with a sponge or something like that, rubber banding a sponge around the intake flow so that it's just not quite as rapidly going through water. But slowly, this will acclimate your aquarium to those slower speeds and all the way throttle down to nothing eventually. Alright, so this may not look very pretty, and that's because I've pulled up the inside of this filter here, and you can see right now it's getting so clogged that it is going to back up and over the edge in just any day now. In fact, the overflow of it draining back out is more than the flow coming out by far. And that is because this is filter floss, and just filter floss, that has been completely saturated and grown over by sediment and beneficial bacteria, algae, cyanobacteria, and debris from the tank. So this tank is completely ready to be filterless. In fact, it almost is now. You could probably just replace this tank's filter with an air stone, and for the purposes of your fish in the tank, see, we've got baby gouramis in this tank with the adults. They've been bred in this tank, by the way, and that's why this tank is so densely planted as well, is because I wanted them to be able to have babies that didn't get eaten right away. So along with the gouramis, we also have some of these gold ring danios, and we also have CPDs or celestial pearl danios that are able to reproduce in the tank because there are enough hiding spots for the babies with all the floating plants, with all the duckweed cover, and I'm constantly removing the duckweed, using it as fertilizer out in the garden. Also, salvinia is another great floating plant too, and that will all give more areas for beneficial bacteria to colonize. So you want to make sure that you're not doing anything major to your tanks when you have tanks that you're getting ready to switch over to filterless. And anything that's a rich surface area, whether it's stones like this or pieces of wood like the ones back in here, that is going to be your beneficial bacteria. That is the same as a filter floss or something. Same like with this moss here, that is going to be your new filter, as well as the substrate. So we'll talk about the substrate in just a moment, but I'm going to show you a tank that is a little less farther along in this process, since this one's just about ready to go. And on the way over there, I'll show you one where this had filters running. Now they're not, and we've actually got a big predatory fish. And don't get me wrong, normally I don't keep larger fish in filterless tanks. However, this happens to be a fish that doesn't need much oxygen in the water. It's a sunfish, and it's a pumpkin seed fish, or a Lepomis gibosus, and they are from warm water lakes near me, near where I live. And having a stone that just puts a little bit of oxygen in is really all I need, as well as the plants and all this surface area. You can see it's been colonized by algae, and that happens slowly. And I actually went from a hang off the back filter to a sponge filter, and I let the sponge filter get clogged. I let it get colonized by algae. Now you want to avoid cyanobacteria from colonizing. So if you see blue-green algae growing on things like a blanket covering almost, that's not what you want to see. You want to see, oh, and by the way, there's his lady friend if y'all haven't met her yet. But now he has a lady friend that he seems to be getting along with a little bit better. Anyways, so this will take care of the same amount of water that it was when the flow was restricted. And when it's a sponge filter, the only thing different you do than a hang off the back filter is you just turn down the flow on the air until it's just a trickle. Same with this here. This is all the way up in the corner of the tank, and it just gets the water to move around a little bit, but this is in the point where it's a quote-unquote never clog air stone, and I'm letting it get to the point where it's clogging, and I'm going to let it clog by not adjusting the nozzle. So let me show you totally filterless. So here we have a totally filterless tank, and this one is supporting an angelfish. And right now, I just put a bunch of plants in here again, a bunch of this grass, because I'm trying to get these white cloud minnows and or the cories to spawn that are in here. But normally, that's a little bit of overkill. You wouldn't need all those plants. But I do want to point out that a lot of people try to go filterless, and they do so without having deep substrate like this, and without having enough plants that feed from the water column. And you really need to have plants that, one, grow fast, and two, feed from the water column, and then three, that have lots of surface area. So you see what a tangled jungle it is, and how roots are coming down from all over, and how we've got like wide leaf plants, narrow leaf plants, but all these different textures and surfaces, they're all covered in beneficial bacteria that is processing your nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. So I always also recommend that you do a test and see where your tank stands. If your nitrates, nitrites, ammonia are all good, then you know that tank was well balanced once that's all dialed in. So once you are ready to convert it to the filterless style like this one, you want to make sure that those parameters stay the same. If you change it over and a week or two later you notice that all those parameters go through the roof, that the nitrates start creeping up, or heaven forbid the nitrites and the ammonia go up, then you've definitely got something wrong. You want to put the filter back on and go back a step. You can always go back a step, and I'm definitely a proponent of taking it slowly and doing it this kind of methodical way. So let's lastly talk about, the fact that the substrate plays a major role in this and will also determine how far you can take this sort of thing. Now, I have filterless tanks up here that are able to keep fish in them just fine, and snails and shrimp, but I wouldn't put any major bioload in here, and I wouldn't put anything I had to feed a lot in here, because they just don't have that ability to process things quickly. You also need a good enough light over your tank, and that is something that can vary. Now, if you've watched my series on this tank here, you'll know that I have a shrimp tank that has no filter or anything. It doesn't have deep substrate either, and it is absolutely flourishing, doing really well. All these shrimp are doing absolutely great, but what you'll also see is that down by the substrate there are these little white dots. Those are seed shrimp, those things moving around. And those are very key if you want to feed less food to your fish. So especially if you have nano fish, those, as well as scuds, black worms, little nematodes like detritus worms, those are all good things. I try to avoid planaria and hydra personally, but just about every other little critter I'll allow in my tanks, because I know that means that there is enough of a biological bacteria, fungal, and algal colony going on that there is an ecosystem with a bunch of different levels. In fact, I would introduce fish to a tank like this that are very small and that could even eat the baby shrimp, because then I wouldn't even need to worry about food that much. Now, with this light, this is only a $12 floodlight, LED floodlight from Home Depot, and it's good enough to take care of mosses and sawassertang and some other plants. But without the floating plants here, we wouldn't have the ability to process enough of the nitrogen cycle with just bacteria alone. And so these plants are really key, and it takes these water lettuce specifically. You'll see that the roots get pretty long when they're doing the filtering. Now, all my filterless tanks, I run at 0 nitrites, 0 nitrates as well. So I'm not anti-filter whatsoever. Here's a tank that's got a sponge filter. Here's another tank where you can see I've got a filter set up, and I actually have the media. I took out the media, the balls, bio balls out of it, and it just has the coarse sponge and then the filter floss, because I'm going to walk it over to being filterless and clog this up. I'm just going to let it naturally clog. So here's a bit cleaner, and a lot of people think that's unsightly, but if you do this correctly and you just take your time and you have a nice ecosystem with a cleanup crew, you know, fish or shrimp or snails that eat things off the bottom, off of the hardscape, like the snails are doing here. And you've got mid-water eaters and top water eaters, and none of your fish are giant fish that go through a ton of nitrogen by eating a ton of food and protein. Then you'll be just fine. It'll handle the whole load just fine. So let's talk about that substrate, that final issue. So if you're going to filterless, you may be fine just transferring it and letting the filter slow to a trickle and stop. However, some fish, in particular threadfins, I've noticed, do much better when they have aeration. So I would leave an air stone in the water with them personally, and I would still do water changes if I want to get them to spawn an extra amount. Now, along with all of this, what's really helpful is having botanicals, dried leaves in there, just for the actual surface area that provides for beneficial bacteria, but also for the medicinal, antifungal, and antibacterial elements that will keep the water column as a whole a lot more content, and it will also keep the water slightly more acidic, so that as you're building up your mulm layer, like this stuff that you want to leave intact when you're doing a filterless tank, this is going to be just as good every square inch of it as your filter would be. And that's why I wanted to show this exposed, is it's very similar what you're seeing. In fact, you're even getting little bits of algae and things growing in the filter when you have a filter like that. So that is fine. And if you have coarse sand, it will work its way and settle down throughout the sand. Now here you can see we've even got blackbeard algae and a few other things in this tank, but none of it took over because there's so many kinds of algae in here that they're all in equilibrium, trying to kind of find a place in the tank. So no one algae has taken over. They're all balanced. So for the substrate, like I said, if it's handling it when you're doing your tests a few weeks in, that's great. If it's not, you can give it a helping hand, a boost over here by adding more substrate. Now, I recommend using either something like Fluval stratum or something like this Brightwell Aquatics Rio Escurio F, or whatever, Florin Volcanite. It just means it's pressed clay that's mineral rich. If you add ADA Amazonia soil or something like that that has nitrogen and ammonia in it, then you're going to need to cap it. And that's a whole other video that we can talk about. But you can also use these volcanic soils like Fluval stratum or like Brightwell, or like fluorite, sand, or gravel even. Although those are less, those don't harbor minerals in them so much, whereas these clay-based pellets that are round for your aquarium, they will, one, have more surface area for the good bacteria, that same mulm look that we're going for. All that fluffy area is going to be processing your nitrates, your nitrites, and your ammonia. Also, your plants then will feed from this. As it compacts into a layer, it will stratify, and the sand cap eventually will become almost a strainer or a filter for all that mulm to work through. Now, if you're gravel vacuuming, that process never builds up and that won't happen. But if you're doing it this way, you'll actually get all sorts of little life forms living in there that are even so small you can't see them, and that's where your baby fish can even be raised in these aquariums. And that's what this little guy's doing, is he's grazing for food, eating whatever it is that's in there, the little microscopic stuff. I also have videos where you can see the difference under the microscope of just how much life comes to an aquarium after 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. So I would say that you want to run an aquarium for 6 months to a year, ideally, before you're going to transfer it over to filterless. Now, I have videos on how to set it up filterless in the first place and taking it easy on that, but this is specifically if you're going to take a tank that has plenty of fish, plenty of plants, and you want to turn it into a filterless tank. This can be turned off at any moment now and it'll be fine, which is a good place to be because in the summer we tend to get power outages with these kind of freak windstorms we get from time to time, and also just the grid gets overloaded from time to time. But it's early in the morning and you can see that the CPDs are actually they're flirting with one another, and so they'll be scattering their eggs around the tank this morning, and hopefully a few of them will hatch and be able to hide deep in the plants here. And the other thing to know is when you've got this tank and you've got deep enough substrate for immersed plants like this Bacopa or this Persicaria, this stuff is able to grow just as good as CO2 would grow other plants in your aquariums because it's up and out of the water. So the fact that the light doesn't have to go through the water, that the CO2 and the oxygen doesn't have to be gathered through water, makes it that much easier for the plants to respire, transpire, water, oxygen, CO2, all that stuff. Yet it's getting all its minerals and nutrients just as well from the substrate, which will eventually stratify out into layers if you have different densities of substrate, which I recommend doing a layer of gravel, like pea gravel, a layer of sand, a layer of your soil or aqua soil, which will have the nutrients for those plants, and then a layer of a sand cap or some sort of cap if you have actual ammonia and nitrogen or root tabs like this guy impregnated in your soil. Then I think it's good to have a level of capping on it, but go watch those videos on their own. But that's all there really is to it. It's just about taking it easy, and remember, you can always go back, you can always add the filter back. So maybe put the filter, if you have more than one tank, put it on another tank, or leave it running on a bucket if you're worried about it for a week or two, and then you can always move it right back over. But here you can see this thing is pretty much just it's a blob monster. It is naturally, it's run its course, it's clogged itself up, and these fish are doing just fine with just that bit of oxygen. So we'll put an air stone in there for a week or two, but due to the species that are in here, we don't even have to have that. These are mostly gouramis and little cyprinids that are all small-bodied fish. They all eat very small amounts bioload wise, and the gouramis can breathe air from the top of the water level, and the little cyprinids, they don't need that much dissolved oxygen in the water to be happy, nor do the danios or anything else that's living in here at the moment. So choose your fish wisely, your plants wisely. You want those to be growing abundantly, quickly, and with lots of surface area, and you'll have absolutely no problems going to filterless. So good luck, thanks for watching, and if you want to support what we do on the channel here, you can always become a member or check us out on Patreon. The links are all in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.